Welcome everyone to the latest installment of MSP Business School. I'm Brian Doyle, and with me as always, I've got my co-hosts, Tim McNeil and Rob Rogers. What's up, gentlemen?
Living the dream. How you doing?
Oh, you stole my line. That's my move, man. That's what I say every time.
Another day in paradise. You guys really need to work on some a little bit more excitement, enthusiasm, or at least better lines.
We're doing fantastic, Brian. How are you doing today?
I'm supremely tremendous at all times.
Okay, very good.
Life is good. Yeah. The sun is shining. The birds are singing, Rob.
That's right.
But before we carry this much further, as I always like to say, nobody's really here to hear us talk. It's all about our guests, and I'm really excited to have Brian Scott, President and CIO of ClearTone Consulting, and which also delivers the 501 CISO program, to the call today. Brian is a customer of mine at vCIO Toolbox, and I'm excited to have him join us here on the podcast, because what I came to learn about Brian is he while he's in the service provider community, he's actually held roles in the enterprise that we're going to talk about today, and really can give us some guidance into what's a CISO's perspective of what a vCISO should be doing for the company. So I think that's a question that comes up often when I'm doing demos, and I'm really excited to have Brian give us his perspective on it. So welcome.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this. I'm certainly a relatively new but happy customer. And if anyone's living the dream, as you can tell from my little smoky dog over there,
don't do it. Don't do it.
I'm living the dream.
I'm
living the dream.
All right. That's all right. We'll see.
Good old Rocky Top.
We like it because Tim's in pain now. And that was a fantastic game.
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. We could start an offshoot show where we could talk a little bit more sports, though. So today we'll talk a little bit more about security, right?
It'll be our next roundtable.
Right.
So Brian, we always love to kick things off with, how did you end up in the crazy world of, service provider life, right? Very few of us set out with that course. It just seems to find you. So tell us a little bit about your backstory and, how you arrived here.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I was educated as an electrical engineer, and I worked a couple of years in that field, which moves incredibly slowly. Working in circuits, you can't change them very quickly. And so I was always a software geek and programming on the side. And so I quickly moved over into software engineering and had a full career as a software engineer and got into architecture and data architecture. And then that led into management roles. And so then for the last 20 years, I've been at the C level. So either CIO, CTO, and CISO for organizations. The last organization that I was with, and the largest one that I worked for, these were medium-sized companies, but had about 700 employees, about 100 million in revenue. And I had an IT team of around 85 folks.
Wow.
And we were, it was a highly compliance-driven environment because we had proprietary software that we had written that was processing about $400 million a year in credit card transactions on behalf of our customers, not our own money, but their funds, which is service provider model for PCI. And so we were audited every year, of course, for that, as well as SOC 2 Type 2, and our parent company did a full NIST-based audit. So basically, I had 3 audits a year almost. We just went from audit to audit to audit. So that was my security education, if you will, coming out of the software side with that. Moving into becoming a consultant on the service provider side, I'd seen my fair share of consultants, as you can imagine, after 20 years, at the C-suite level. And I thought one of 2 things usually with consultants, which was one is they were really, really smart, and I really liked them, and I wanted to learn from them. And I kept in touch with many of them, are mentors for me today. And I thought that's a pretty cool job because they get to touch a lot of customers and help a lot of customers, and and it's always something different. And I kind of like that. The other thing I would think about them is like, boy, they're really horrible and they should not be doing this job, so, and I could definitely do better than that if I was to do this. And so with COVID, which changed a lot of companies' landscapes, and it was certainly affecting drastically the company I was with, I decided at that time that it was the right time to step out and start ClearTone Consulting, which is what I've been doing now for about 2.5 years. in that role, I was providing some general fractional CIO work, which I still do, and some CTO type work, software related consulting. But I just found that security kept coming up time and time again. Obviously, it's a huge topic in our world today. And so starting the beginning of this year, I think I decided I'm going to focus in that area. I found so many customers needed so much help in that area. I felt a lot of satisfaction in being able to help them along. So that's really where I'm focusing with the 501 CISO program that I have.
You've kind of hit it spot on. We've really seen in the industry too, at the end user level, they've become a little, it's just like when managed services came out to the marketplace too. Eventually the MSP's education level catches up where they can start seeing the need for these resources. And as they're looking at, things like cyber liability insurance today, it's getting more difficult for them to prove out the things that they're doing in those policies and ensuring that. And the audit process can be arduous as you laid out, but really it does start with saying, hey, am I doing what I think we're doing? And do I have policies in place to support the objectives that we're trying to meet, right? And it starts really that simply. Would you not agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially there's so many issues, when you're talking about policies, really knowing what you should be doing when you get down into smaller, medium-sized space, which is where I'm focused in a primarily, not only in nonprofit and trade association, but primarily in that space because I'm outside the Washington D.C., the DMV area. It's plush with a lot of the nonprofits and association around here, and they need a lot of help. They don't have IT expertise typically, and when they do, it's pretty small groups, or they rely a lot on vendors, and in that scenarios, I find that they just really haven't organized, formalized what they ought to be doing very much, right? And that starts often with some policies, and not everything. Many of them aren't compliant organizations where they have a compliance program where they have to be, beholden to, but that doesn't. But they swing too far from one or the other. Either you're fully compliant, everything has to have a policy for it, right? Or they have none, right? So we need to find a nice, healthy medium for these organizations where they have the ones that are meaningful and have teeth and really help them. And so that's where I spend certainly some of my time.
And I have to assume some of those kind of customers are also falling into I wouldn't call it chain of custody because they're probably not holding sensitive information from the DoD, but they're certainly being put under vendor risk assessments and maybe being held to some of those safeguards anyway. So by really looking at a program to help them standardize policy and procedures is probably going to help them from a front end basis of securing work as well.
Yeah, it is. Some nonprofits, when they get grants, I think they're starting to see in some of those areas where, depending on where grants are coming from, there's some compliance questions, or we'll just say security requirements that are starting to creep into that. Insurance, you've already mentioned. I mean, they all have insurance or would like cybersecurity insurance, and that's starting to have that. So that's starting to creep in, and hopefully one of the things that I try to take upon myself is I'm trying to help enlighten or educate that industry as a whole. I found into the needs and the criticality of security risks. I still find far too many executives in that area that the light hasn't. It's dim. It's a dim light, right? It just hasn't completely blared bright enough yet that this is really something they need to pay attention to. So education is something I spend quite a bit of time on.
Would you say that's like probably the most important piece of your consulting business is the education and having them understand their risk assessment?
I think so, because doing a risk assessment is one thing, and helping an organization figure out where they are is critical, right? It's key, right? And I call it turning on the lights. That's a turn of phrase that I have. Is back when I was in college, we were all talking about our pre-college days, right? And when the lights were off in that kitchen that we used to, hang out in so much, it actually looked like a pretty nice kitchen. But then you turn on the lights and all of a sudden you realize, oh, this thing hasn't been cleaned in a couple of months, right? And the bugs start scurrying away, right? And so, I mean, it's the same thing in these organizations. If you don't turn on the lights and really know where you are, how can you create a plan And how can you create a roadmap? How can you create a budget, right? Look at staffing. I mean, really, how can you do anything if you
Yeah.
don't have that? And so that's certainly one. So back to your question, I'm sorry. So, but a lot of times these assessments, I mean, it's all in cybersecurity speak, and that
Yeah.
doesn't translate to these executives very well. They're like, well, what does that mean? What do each of these items really mean? So that's where the education comes in. But the education there's another component too, which is it doesn't matter what's in an assessment or how much even they might, want to start moving on some of those roadmap items. If they don't understand how critical it is that they are responsible for developing a security-minded culture,
Mhm.
they're really going to struggle all the time, right? Because it isn't, as we know, success in cybersecurity really has to come as a cultural aspect of the organization.
Oh, I
Well,
mean,
what-
there's stats out there that say 90% of breaches start from the inside, versus the outside, right? And it usually comes through either phishing or some social engineering experiment that goes awry. And if you're not building a culture of cybersecurity, if you're not, it's one thing to get an awareness tool, but if you're not auditing the awareness tool and actually making sure that people are taking the classes that are being dripped out to them over time, it's just not going to matter, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to run into these challenges.
Yeah. I think here's a good area of a good example, right? And this might be something that maybe some of your listeners that are MSSPs or MSPs, they can think about this, but like phishing training, using a tool like KnowBe4 or something, and phishing testing and training, it's almost treated, in my opinion, like a checkbox, like, all right,
Yeah.
you need to do this. And
Totally
like, we
agree.
got it. There you are. But then I come in, I look like, well, okay, 20 or 15% of your staff are failing on a monthly basis, and they've all been trained. And this program's been going on for 2 years now, and you're still at 12% failure. So like, that's just not working, right? I mean, you're not building a culture of, it's just not successful. And so, so something would need to change there. Now, there's no silver bullet to that particular problem, but my point is that you just can't check the box and say, yeah, we send phishing emails. The real resultant, if it's working or not, or if you're being successful in that, is, are you actually, affecting that culture and changing those numbers?
So, I always wrestle with this one too, is who is holding the governance key on that, right? Does that ultimately belong in the business with HR as opposed to IT? Because really, if the end users are not adhering to it, it becomes something that HR would have to stand behind more than IT in order to reinforce it and probably get it done. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think it ultimately has to be the CEO, the president, the executive director, whatever it is. If they're unwilling to jointly own that, and they don't have to understand it all. We're there as CISOs and CIOs to help them. But if they are unwilling to stand up and tell the organization, this is critical to us, and this is my mandate that we improve in these areas, you're probably fighting a bit of a losing battle. That's been my opinion, because all cultural aspects, not just cybersecurity, but it all comes down from the head of an organization. And so you do need to get support from HR. They need to support, because there's going to be a lot of, you're touching all of the staff, and taking some time and educational time and other things. And so you need to have the leadership team as a whole. But therein, like all of the VPs are probably not going to get in line and really want to agree with that unless the CEO is standing behind it. If you get their buy-in, it's just so much easier at that point, right? Then if the CEO is in line with it and says, this is important, let's put a program together, let's look at it. Then all the VPs have much more tendency to want to buy into it, and it just starts to trickle down from that point.
So just going back to your example of that 12% in the phishing before, like, what do you see as those averages? And then out of, if you have those segment of clients or people that you're working with that consistently have that failure rate, how long does it usually take them to realize that, hey, maybe we do need to do something here?
Yeah, get that education going.
Yeah. I've seen a lot. It's been across the board. You know, the stats I read is that they say that 1 in 5 people are still clicking 20%. Most organizations that I've come in and worked at are a little bit better than that. You know, most of them are sitting around 10%. The ones that I start working with. Now,
Wait, hold on, Brian. So you're
That's
telling me
good.
I walk into a room with 10 employees and one of them is going to click on the,
oh, absolutely, absolutely, every
that
month,
hurts.
right? Every month,
And
and
that's a good number?
well, it's better than the 20%, which I've read is what the national average is 20%, right?
Wow.
Wow.
But here's the scarier stat off of this, because you know KnowBe4 does a good job of this, and other groups do too. I just have several clients that are using KnowBe4, but you know they not only see who clicked, but it's who filled out information. They're asking you for some
Sure.
information,
Mm,
credential information, right? And the national stat is of those that have a tendency to click and do click, 2/3 of them will actually go ahead and fill out their credential information. So that's horrific, right?
Ooh.
So yeah, and so so I think the best I've seen organizations get down to is about 2%, right? You know, 2% failure rate, which that's the best I've ever seen it get, and you know that's not bad. And what I tell you what I like looking at you know some tools where we can just stop relying on people's decision making. You know,
Sure.
so for example, like Microsoft has the safe links. You know, if you're licensed properly, right, then you can have safe attachments and safe links, and you can have them starting to really kind of go through those links and try to look for that. And because I don't think there's there's not much better chance of getting much better than that 2 to 5%. That's about as good as you're gonna have, which is still risk. You know.
Yep.
Wow.
But, you know, unfortunately, there is no absolute zero, because as long as there's a human element, we're always
Yep.
going to have people
Yeah,
that are
it's
making
always gonna be
mistakes.
there.
And some of
Always.
those mistakes, or most of those mistakes, let's be fair here, are not done with malicious intent. And
Oh, yeah.
even with education, in the
Yeah.
moment, people will make mistakes, and that's why we've got to have other
People
safeguards
just not
as
paying
well.
attention as they're
Yeah,
flying through their day, you know. They read the gist of the the subject header or something, and away
Oh,
they go.
please,
It's-
I'm constantly telling my
there's
wife
so
when she
many.
gets emails that to click on the from address and see if it's actually from who you think it is.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
step
Yeah.
number one, but that hasn't worked very well for me.
But you know, talking about yeah, I know, right? Talking about human error, though, I mean, I don't know if we can chalk this one up to human error, but the data shows right now, as I understand it, that you know success through phishing is starting to wane and starting to go down, and incidents are starting to rise and on just vulnerabilities, you know, misconfigurations, right?
Okay.
Known misconfigurations or vulnerabilities that are known that are just not addressed. Now, I don't know if I'd call that human error, or, you know, in some cases it might be error. In some cases, it's just we haven't got the time to do it, you know, and we just haven't got there, you know, because MFA is so many people finally got MFA rolled out, and it made that much harder. I think we're seeing those numbers starting to curve a little bit, and so they're going to the next.
You're moving on to the next
hackers are relatively lazy. They're going to take the road to least existence, right? And least resistance, not least existence. We wish.
We wish.
Right. But so I think we're going to see a big swing now on this over the next. My guess is over the next 3 years, a big increase on vulnerability. So, which is good for businesses that are addressing that.
Well, it's also, I think it's great that you're talking about nonprofits and putting out RFPs. I think it's great that they're putting that language in there. That I've got to imagine that's a newer thing, and I can also only imagine that's going to become more prevalent as we progress into the next thing.
Well, you've heard the phrase, it's the world we live in now. And I think that I use a couple of metaphors when I'm talking to customers, but believe it or not, and I'm certainly old enough to remember this, but there was a time when email was relatively new, and a lot of people, there were people in the workplace that are like, I don't want to use that, that's just, I'm just going to do it this other way, right? And there was that time, and that was there was a generation, if you will, or a segment of the workforce that was resistant to email. Now, to say that today, it's almost like, how could that ever be, right? I mean, how could it's so ubiquitous and fundamental in everything that we do. Well, I mean, we're just in that curve now. I mean, having a security mindset and being aware of security and having people at both budgets and their mental attention and time go to security related things. It's just the world we live in. It's the norm, and people are, the workforce as a whole is catching up to this new norm. Now, what those things are going to change, year over year over year as the attack, space changes. But it is the new workspace norm that we live in.
And I think, some of this will decrease as the digital natives continue to, grow up and take roles and responsibilities on, they've got a little bit more security mindset from day one. But, again, if that's not being ingrained into the culture, as you referred to, or, earlier, and it's not being supported by the top down, it really doesn't matter, because now you're just waiting for the game of catch up to occur. And you've really got to look at accelerating that, because the threats are real. Most companies fall in that non-targeted sector. But the reality is there's enough bots in there that are just looking for a point of penetration. If they find it, they may do something.
Yeah, I mean, it's another, I think, interesting aspect that I go over in my industry, is that so much of the attack space is automated, right? And personless, right? Headless, if you will, because they're, the same automation tools that exist in our normal work life and capabilities like AI, right? All of that's being applied into the attack space, right? And so a lot of organizations might think, why would anyone want to target, the American Society of blah blah blah? Like, why would anyone want that? And it's that, well, they aren't, right? These are just bots and automated tools, and they're just throwing, and here's something.
It's
All
just
right,
whatever they call it.
Something pops up on the
Yeah.
dashboard.
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Yep. Very true.
Yeah.
So we're getting near the end of our time here. Brian, I think you had mentioned to us at the top of the, as we were preparing for the call, you've got kind of an interesting program called, I think it was 501
501 CISO.
CISO.
So,
Yeah.
You want to kind of expand on what that might be all about?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Obviously, there's a play on 501c organizations, which are nonprofit, which is nonprofit and trade associations, which are 501cs, is my primary focus. Although I do work with several for-profit organizations as well. But that is a fractional CISO program that has a lot of services bundled in it, and I've bundled it in a way that it's basically a subscription payment model, right? So they just customers of mine pay a monthly amount and get a certain amount of services and recurrent services with that. It's easy to budget. They understand what it is. And one of the main things those organizations need is, and I found this just from trial and errors, right? I went back when I was doing some earlier assessments when I started consulting, and I checked back in 6 months and a year later with those customers, and I say, hey, how's it going? How are you progressing against that roadmap? And 12 months later, with a roadmap with 10 items on it or something, or 12 items, I would hear things like, well, we're just about to finish number 1, after 12 months. And I'm like, oh, these organizations don't need just that. They need a champion. They need someone talking to the executive levels. They need someone keeping the focus and the accountability on the MSPs or the internal staff to move the ball down the field, right? They need someone to carry that lantern for them in that. And so that's what this provides. It allows me to continually engage with them to provide some transparency in that space and some accountability.
And and it's critical to have that accountability partner. We talk about it all the time, from being just peer groups supporting ourselves, right, as part of being a service provider. But as you see some of these regulations changing, and while some of the 501cs might not think they're bound but to it, if they're touching any sensitive data that's coming downhill, especially in your region where there's a lot of DoD work, the DoD is starting to look at this and say, where are you in your POAM? are you actually adhering to this, or were these dates just to placate our contract before?
Yeah.
And, you know, then they're starting to look as they evolve CMMC at how this is going to come into the vendor risk profile as well. So, you know, the more you can get that champion working early, the more you can show consistent, you know, consistent growth towards your POAM and, you know, building those solutions in. I think you'll see this become a much easier process for many. So,
yeah,
but
that's my hope.
Yeah, and I think if we illustrated anything today, this is why, you know, a CISO role really goes beyond, or the vCISO role as well goes beyond just your stack of tools and the reporting that goes with it. It really comes down to somebody's got to establish the culture, make sure that ownership has buy-in, and is giving them, you know, regular status on what's good and what's bad, so they can then make actionable decisions that they might not be able to decipher just from a pure report.
Well said, Brian. That's perfectly said.
I may have done that pitch
I
once
might
or
use
twice.
that.
I was going to say, it's almost like you know
that.
that. It's so weird.
But with that being said, Brian, any closing comments from you before we wrap up today?
Well, I just appreciate what you guys are doing with your software and trying to support folks like myself. And I also found you guys just really open to, you know, to feedback and working together. You know, I think on one of our calls we said, hey, together as the user and the provider out there and the software team, you know, together we can win moving forward. So I appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you for years here.
Yep, and we thank you for joining us today. It's always great to get some perspective outside the, you know, the core, even though you're in the service provider world now, you know, folks having a rich history of really doing it in a way that a lot of MSPs unfortunately have not been exposed to, just because of the realities of working with SMB customers. You know, it's great to get that insight. So, you know, thank you for joining us today. Rob, want to take us home?
I gotta say, Brian, you're a pretty smart fella. Even though you went to, you know, University of Tennessee.
Oh, here it is.
I was like, okay, I was kind of impressed with you. Not bad.
Of course, my ego is getting stroked because I thought you're talking to me.
I don't know. Go Gators. That's all I can say.
Yeah, and roll tide.
I'm just glad y'all understood what I was saying.
Yeah. Hey, you know, look, for anybody that's looking to get in touch with Brian, we will be including his LinkedIn profile with the podcast, to include the link that we were talking about today, 501 CISO. Am I correct?
Yeah, 501
All right.
501CISO.com.
There you go. And this episode will be up on MSPBusinessSchool.com and anywhere that you get your podcast out there. Brian, Tim, it was a pleasure today, everybody. Take care and have a great week.
Yeah,
Thanks
for coming on.